Hello and welcome to Fireside History. Today, we're diving into the Boston Massacre. An image of tyranny is seared into the American mind. A line of soldiers firing on defenseless citizens. But the most critical battle was not fought with snowballs and bayonets. It was fought inside a courtroom, with the soul of a future nation at stake. The story's real twist involves a patriot lawyer defending the men everyone called murderers. Why would he risk his reputation for the enemy? How did a quest for justice accidentally forge the perfect piece of propaganda that would unite a rebellion? The truth is far more interesting than the legend. Let's begin with today's story. To understand the explosion, you first have to see how the fuse was lit. Long before the gunshots of 1770, Boston was a city holding its breath. The trouble started, as it often does, with money and pride. In 1767, the British Parliament passed the Townshend Acts. These were taxes on everyday goods the colonists couldn't make themselves. Things like glass, lead, paint, and tea suddenly cost more. For the colonists, this was not just an economic pinch. It was an insult. They were being taxed by a government thousands of miles away, a government in which they had no voice. The famous slogan, "No taxation without representation," wasn't just a catchy phrase. It was the core of their frustration. They protested, boycotted British goods, and made it very clear they were not happy. London's response was not to negotiate. It was to send in the army. In October 1768, 2 regiments of British soldiers, the 14th and 29th, arrived in Boston. Suddenly, the city's narrow streets were filled with over 2,000 redcoats. This was 1 soldier for every 4 citizens. The British hoped their presence would intimidate the colonists into obedience. It did the exact opposite. The Quartering Act made things worse. It required colonists to house and supply the soldiers. Even if they weren't in your home, they were in public buildings and rented spaces, a constant visible reminder of British authority. These soldiers were also poorly paid. They often sought part-time work, competing with local laborers for jobs and driving down wages. Friction was immediate and personal. It wasn't just about high-minded political ideals anymore. It was about a soldier getting drunk in your favorite tavern. It was about losing a dockside job to a man in a red coat. Street brawls between soldiers and citizens became a regular occurrence. Boston was no longer just a colonial city. It was an occupied city, simmering with a resentment that was about to boil over. Captain Preston and his 7 men pushed their way through the seething crowd. Their goal was simple: rescue the isolated Sentry, Private White, and secure the king's money in the custom house. They managed to reach White, forming a tight defensive semicircle around the building steps. With bayonets fixed, they created a small island of red coats in a sea of angry colonists. This was not an act of aggression. It was a desperate measure. Preston had no orders to fire, and he certainly didn't want to. He repeatedly ordered the crowd to disperse. His voice was likely lost in the deafening roar. The mob, now numbering several hundred, did not back down. In fact, seeing the soldiers form a line only seemed to enrage them further. They saw it as a challenge. The verbal assault intensified. Taunts turned into dares. "Fire, you cowards, fire if you dare." Snowballs were now mixed with chunks of ice, oyster shells, and pieces of wood. A group of sailors, led by a tall man of mixed African and Native American heritage named Crispus Attucks, pushed to the front. Attucks was defiant, grabbing a soldier's bayonet and shouting at Preston. The soldiers were terrified. They were penned in, their backs to a wall, surrounded by a screaming, violent mob that was closing in by the second. They were being hit with projectiles. Their muskets were being struck with clubs. You can imagine the fear, the adrenaline, the confusion of it all. They were young men, thousands of miles from home, and they were about to lose control. Then it happened. A club flew through the air and struck Private Hugh Montgomery, knocking him to the ground. As he struggled to his feet, enraged and disoriented, he fired his musket into the crowd. For a heartbeat, there was a stunned silence. Then, after a brief, ragged pause, the other soldiers opened fire. Let's rewind the clock just a few minutes on that chaotic evening of March the 5th. Before the bells, before the main squad of soldiers, the entire storm began with one man. Private Hugh White of the 29th Regiment stood his post outside the custom house on King Street, likely bored and cold. The trouble found him in the form of a young wigmaker's apprentice named Edward Garrick. The argument that started it all was, frankly, petty. Garrick recognized the Sentry and decided to start something. He pointed at an officer walking by, Captain Lieutenant John Goldfinch, and loudly declared that the captain had not paid his master's bill for a wig. It was a public accusation designed to shame the officer and, by extension, the entire British Army. Private White was having none of it. He stepped forward, insisting that Captain Goldfinch was an honorable gentleman who paid his debts. Garrick fired back that there were no gentlemen left in the 29th Regiment. The two exchanged increasingly sharp insults, their voices rising in the cold air. It was a classic schoolyard standoff, but with much higher stakes. Finally, having had enough of the apprentice's insolence, White lost his temper. He swung his heavy musket and struck Garrick hard on the side of the head. The apprentice fell to the ground, crying out in pain and fury. That was the spark. Garrick's shouts immediately attracted the attention of his friends and other passers-by. A small crowd of boys and young men gathered around White, who was now alone and the center of very hostile attention. They began shouting at him, calling him a coward and a lobsterback. What had been a private dispute over a bill had just become a public spectacle. And in the charged atmosphere of occupied Boston, a spectacle was all it took to draw a mob. The situation was about to spiral out of control. The mob was no longer just a collection of angry men. It had a heartbeat, a rhythm of shouts and stomping feet on cobblestone. From the back, you could hear the constant huzzing and a chorus of dares. But at the front, the atmosphere was different. It was intimate and brutally physical. Men were not just throwing projectiles. They were close enough to jab at the soldiers' chests, daring them to retaliate. A new energy surged through the crowd with the arrival of the sailors. Led by the imposing figure of Crispus Attucks, these were not apprentices out for a thrill. They were tough, hardened men from the docks who saw the redcoats as rivals for jobs and respect. Attucks allegedly grabbed one soldier's bayonet, refusing to let go. This was a direct physical challenge, escalating the confrontation from a chaotic riot to a face-to-face battle of wills. The soldiers were swallowing their fear, trying to hold the line. They were trained to follow orders, but there were no clear orders to follow. Only the roar of the crowd and the sting of ice on their faces. Captain Preston was shouting something, but his voice was a ghost in the gale of noise. Each soldier was an island, isolated in his own terror, his finger trembling on the trigger. The final push came from the very men who felt the most invincible. A group pressed forward, swinging clubs made from barrel staves with terrifying force. They began striking not just the men, but their muskets. They were trying to disarm them, to utterly humiliate them. It was a calculated act of dominance, driven by the fatal belief that the soldiers would not, and could not, shoot back. Then a heavy piece of wood flew from the darkness. It struck Private Hugh Montgomery squarely on the arm and knocked his musket from his hands. He stumbled, falling hard against the icy ground. In that moment, something inside him snapped. It was not a decision. It was a reflex born of panic and rage. Scrambling to his feet, Montgomery recovered his weapon aimed into the screaming faces, and pulled the trigger. The night exploded in a single deafening crack. The gunpowder smoke rolled away to reveal a scene from a nightmare. The defiant roar of the mob had been replaced by the gurgling groans of dying men. On the blood-slicked cobblestones of King Street, the abstract political argument had become horrifyingly real. The volley itself lasted only a few seconds. The battle for what it meant would consume the next year. The central question was simple. Did Captain Preston order his men to shoot? The answer was a mess of contradictions. A townsman named Daniel Calef would later swear under oath that he stood right behind Preston. He insisted he heard no command to fire. In fact, he heard Preston rebuke his men for shooting. Yet other witnesses swore the opposite, claiming the captain's order was sharp and unmistakable. It was one man's word against another's, with 8 lives hanging in the balance. The defense had its own powerful narrative. Private Montgomery had been attacked, clubbed to the ground in an act of direct assault. His shot was not an act of malice, but of panic and self-preservation. This single moment would become the cornerstone of the soldiers' legal defense. It transformed them from aggressors into victims who had been pushed past their breaking point. Could a jury convict men who were defending their own lives? But a strange and disturbing detail emerged from the carnage. Medical examinations found that 11 balls had struck the victims. This was a mathematical impossibility. Only 7 soldiers had fired their muskets. Where did the other shots come from? Whispers began to circulate about shadowy figures seen in the windows of the custom house, directly above the soldiers. Some people began to wonder if the redcoats on the street were the only ones who had fired into the crowd that night. The initial, ragged blast of gunfire was over. The soldiers, now surrounded by the very tragedy they had created, nervously reloaded their weapons. Captain Preston, his authority shattered, struggled to restore order to his stunned and terrified men. The physical confrontation had ended in blood and confusion. Now the real fight, the one that would take place in a courtroom and on the pages of pamphlets, was about to begin. The moment the shooting stopped, a new war began. It was not a war of muskets and bayonets, but of ink, engravings, and reputation. The battle was over the memory of the dead. Their identities would become the most crucial evidence in the fight for the soul of Boston. Who they were would determine whether this was a massacre or a justifiable defense. The Patriot propaganda machine, led by figures like Paul Revere, moved with incredible speed. Revere created a now famous engraving of the event. It was a masterpiece of political spin. His image showed a neat line of sneering soldiers firing a coordinated volley into a small, helpless crowd of well-dressed gentlemen. There was no chaos, no snowballs, no clubs. It was cold-blooded murder. This powerful image needed victims who fit the part, and the narrative was quickly crafted. Crispus Attucks was cast as the ultimate symbol of liberty. Samuel Gray became the honest working man. James Caldwell was the hardy sailor, and 17-year-old Samuel Maverick was the innocent youth, struck down by indiscriminate violence. Together, they formed the perfect picture of a peaceful community slaughtered by tyrants. This was the story that was printed in pamphlets and spread like fire throughout the colonies. But the Loyalists and the soldiers' future defense team were preparing a very different story. They began to paint the crowd not as citizens, but as a dangerous rabble. They described them as a mob of rowdy sailors, insolent apprentices, and outsiders, all fueled by rum and resentment. In their version, the soldiers were not the aggressors. They were the victims, trapped and terrified by a violent mob. The defense strategy would focus intensely on Crispus Attucks. In court, he would be portrayed not as the first martyr of a revolution, but as its chief instigator. They would describe him as a towering, aggressive man who personally assaulted a soldier and led the charge. The trial, it became clear, would not just be about what the soldiers did. It would be a trial of the victims themselves. Before the last man hit the ground, the story of what happened on King Street was already being written. The Patriot leadership did not react with grief, but with the cold efficiency of a political machine kicking into high gear. This was not about mourning the dead. It was about weaponizing them. The first and most brilliant move came from Samuel Adams. He gave the chaotic brawl a new name, one designed for maximum impact. This would not be known as the King Street incident. It would be the Boston Massacre. The name itself was a verdict, framing the soldiers as murderers before any trial could begin. It was a brand, and it was perfect. Next came the image. Paul Revere, a silversmith with a talent for propaganda, created his famous engraving. It was a calculated lie. His version showed a neat line of sneering soldiers firing a disciplined volley into a small, peaceful crowd. He conveniently left out the snowballs, the clubs, and the mob's aggression. He even renamed the Custom House Butcher's Hall for good measure. This powerful picture became the accepted truth for thousands who would never read a single witness statement. To support this visual lie, the Patriots needed written proof. They gathered 96 depositions from townsfolk, but this was no impartial investigation. They carefully selected witnesses who would paint the soldiers as villains and buried any testimony that suggested provocation. This curated evidence was published in a pamphlet titled A Short Narrative of the Horrid Massacre. It gave their emotional story the weight of official fact. The final act was a masterpiece of political theater. A massive public funeral was held for the victims. Thousands marched in a solemn procession, a powerful display of unity and grief. It was an event designed to transform a riot into a sacred moment of martyrdom. The name provided the headline, the engraving provided the image, and the funeral provided the heart. Together, they created an ironclad narrative that made a fair trial for the soldiers seem utterly impossible. The propaganda war had been won in a matter of days. The power of the engraving lay not just in its lies, but in its profound understanding of human psychology. It was a weapon designed to bypass logic and strike directly at the heart. Every alteration from reality was a calculated decision made to amplify outrage and erase any hint of moral ambiguity. The goal was not to inform, but to incite. Consider the soldiers. Transforming their panicked defensive semicircle into a rigid straight line was a stroke of genius. A semicircle suggests a group under pressure, reacting to a threat from the front. A straight line suggests discipline, order, and control. This single artistic choice reframed the entire event. It visually argued that this was not a chaotic breakdown of order, but a deliberate, coordinated act of state-sanctioned murder. It was an execution, not a panicked reaction. The victims received a similar upgrade. The real crowd was a rough mix of sailors and laborers, men who had been brawling with soldiers for days. Revere replaced them with a small cluster of well-dressed, respectable gentlemen. This was a strategic appeal to the colonial elite. It transformed a working-class street fight into an assault on the very fabric of civilized society. The message was clear: if they can shoot down men like these, then none of us are safe. Even the smallest details served this purpose. The addition of a small, innocent puppy in the foreground was a masterstroke of emotional manipulation. The clear, bright sky removed the chaotic context of a dark, icy night where mistakes could be made. And of course, the unsubtle labeling of the custom house as Butcher's Hall removed any need for interpretation. Revere was not documenting an event. He was building a case, piece by piece, on paper. He was creating a new, simpler reality, one so emotionally potent and visually clear that it would render the complicated truth completely irrelevant. A small aside. If you are enjoying this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. You will help us a lot to continue making more content like this. Truly, even though it's a simple click, it's the motivation we have to continue sharing history. Thank you. The trials were over, but the story was not. The legal system had delivered its complicated, nuanced verdict, but on the streets of Boston, the simple, powerful lie had already won. The acquittals did not calm the city. They enraged it further, serving as proof that the system was rigged against them. The memory of the massacre was now too valuable a weapon to be disarmed by mere facts. March the 5th was institutionalized. It became a civic holiday in Boston, known as Massacre Day. Every year, the city would gather to hear a fiery orator recount the horrors of that night, keeping the wound fresh and the anger hot. It was an annual injection of revolutionary fervor, ensuring that the curated myth of British butchery would not be forgotten. The 5 deaths became the emotional fuel for a decade of resistance. The event set the two Adams cousins on starkly different paths. Samuel, the master propagandist, saw his influence soar. He had successfully transformed a street brawl into a foundational myth of American oppression. His path was that of the revolutionary, using outrage to build a movement. John, the man of principle, paid a heavy price. His heroic defense of the law earned him temporary isolation. Yet, in that courtroom, he had laid down a marker for the kind of nation he wanted to build. A nation where justice was a shield for all, not just a sword for the popular. His path was that of the statesman, building a foundation of law that could outlast the passions of the moment. The story of the massacre became a ghost that haunted every future confrontation with the crown. It was the ultimate example of British tyranny. The bloody shirt waved to justify every act of defiance. When colonists dumped tea into the harbor a few years later, the memory of those 5 coffins was in their minds. The road to revolution is paved with grievances, real and imagined, and the bloody cobblestones of King Street became one of its most important paving stones. The prosecution's first move was a calculated gamble. They chose to try Captain Preston separately from his men. The logic was simple and ruthless. If they could convict the officer of giving the command to fire, the soldiers were automatically guilty of obeying it. One trial to condemn them all. Their entire case was built on a single invisible piece of evidence: the sound of a man's voice in a storm of noise. Witness after witness took the stand for the prosecution. A man named William Wyatt swore he heard the captain give a clear and distinct order to fire. Another, Daniel K.F., insisted the command was sharp and unmistakable. On the surface, their testimony seemed to seal Preston's fate. They painted a clear picture of a cold-blooded officer ordering the execution of unarmed citizens. It was exactly the story the city of Boston wanted to hear. But under John Adams' cross-examination, this simple story began to fall apart. He didn't accuse the men of lying. He simply highlighted the impossibility of certainty. One witness swore Preston stood behind his men when he gave the order. Another insisted he was in front of them. The details, the small facts that build a case, were a mess of contradictions. In the deafening chaos of bells and screams, how could anyone be sure of what they heard? The fatal blow to the prosecution's case came from a man named Richard Palms. He testified for the defense that he stood inches from Preston just moments before the shooting. He had asked the captain directly if he intended to fire. Preston's reply, according to Palms, was a clear and emphatic by no means. Now the jury was faced with an impossible choice. Who to believe? Distant witnesses in a mob, or the man who had stood face to face with the captain? The prosecution's strategy had backfired. By isolating the captain, they had made the entire case hinge on one ambiguous word, lost in a hurricane of sound. That signal from Samuel Adams was not a call for a riot. It was the starting gun for an operation planned with remarkable precision. The war whoop that followed was the cue. Men began streaming out of the Old South Meeting House, not in a chaotic mob, but in organized groups. They moved with a clear sense of purpose toward designated meeting spots nearby. This was where the transformation happened. In the shadows of workshops and homes, men shed their colonial clothes. They smeared their faces with soot and grease paint. They wrapped themselves in blankets and armed themselves with hatchets and axes. They were disguising themselves as Mohawk Indians. This was not an attempt to fool anyone. Everyone knew who they were. The disguise was symbolic. It was a way for them to adopt the identity of a free people of the American continent. They were declaring they were no longer subjects of a distant king, but something new, something independent. The costume also provided a convenient layer of anonymity for the destructive work ahead. Once disguised, they formed a column. Hundreds of men marched in near silence through the darkened streets toward Griffin's Wharf. The discipline was astonishing. This was not the screaming, chaotic mob of the massacre. This was a silent, determined procession. Crowds of onlookers lined the route, watching this strange parade pass by. They reached the wharf where the 3 tea ships, the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver, sat quietly at anchor. The leaders of the party divided their men into 3 groups, one for each vessel. They approached the ships and demanded the keys to the cargo holds. The ship captains, seeing a small army of axe-wielding men, wisely chose not to argue. The time for debate was over. With Captain Preston a free man, the city's rage was far from satisfied. The real prize was still in the dock. In late November, the trial began for the 8 soldiers who had actually pulled the triggers. The men facing the jury were Corporal William Weems and Private Hugh White. They were joined by Hugh Montgomery, Matthew Kilroy, and William Warren. The list of defendants concluded with John Carroll, James Hartigan, and William Macaulay. This time, the question was not about a single ambiguous command. It was about fear. John Adams's strategy had to evolve. He was no longer defending an officer, but the actions of individual soldiers. His entire case was built on the 18th century principle of self-defense. He had to prove these men had a reasonable belief that their lives were in mortal danger. To do this, Adams had to destroy the myth of the innocent crowd. He needed to replace it with his own vivid picture of a violent, lawless mob. His goal was to prove the soldiers were targets of what he called a motley rabble of outsiders and troublemakers. Adams began by calling witnesses who painted a terrifying scene. They described a night not of protest, but of assault. One witness, a merchant named Andrew, gave chilling testimony. He described the soldiers as being surrounded and hemmed in by a crowd armed with clubs and chunks of ice. The defense focused relentlessly on the physical attacks. Witness after witness described the hail of projectiles. They recalled the thud of heavy clubs against the soldiers' muskets. The key moment, the one that Adams returned to again and again, was the attack on Hugh Montgomery. The court heard how a heavy piece of wood flew from the crowd. It struck Montgomery and knocked him to the icy ground. In that moment, Adams argued, Montgomery was not a soldier in a disciplined line. He was a man fighting for his life. Adams was not just defending the soldiers. He was putting the mob on trial. The evidence was in. The witnesses had spoken. Now, the fate of the 8 soldiers rested on the shoulders of one man. John Adams rose to deliver his closing argument. This was not just a speech to a jury. It was a lecture to a nation, a defense of an idea that was far more fragile than the men on trial. He did not argue the soldiers were heroes. He did not claim they were innocent of the killings. Instead, he made a crucial distinction. He told the jury this was not murder, because murder requires malice. We have entertained a great variety of phrases to avoid calling this sort of homicide murder, he argued. He called it Self-defense, an act born from the terror of being swarmed by a violent mob. Then Adams played his trump card, a voice from the grave. He reminded the jury of Patrick Carr, one of their own martyrs. He repeated the doctor's testimony. Carr, on his deathbed, had forgiven the men who shot him. He had called it self-defense. How could the jury demand vengeance when the victim himself had offered forgiveness? This led to the powerful climax of his speech. Adams looked at the jury, men under immense pressure from their neighbors to convict. He delivered the immortal line, "Facts are stubborn things," he declared. "And whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passion, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence." He was telling them to be deaf to the rage outside the courtroom walls. His final appeal was to a higher duty, not a duty to Boston or to the Patriot cause, but to the law itself. He argued that protecting the rights of these hated men was the ultimate test of a free society. To follow the law, even when it was unpopular, was the only thing that separated them from tyranny. He had given the jury a shield of principle. Now they had to decide if they had the courage to use it. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. When they finally returned, the courtroom was thick with a tense, expectant silence. The city of Boston, and indeed the colonies, awaited a verdict born from rage. What they received was something far more complicated. The foreman stood to deliver the judgment. For 6 of the soldiers, including the Sentry Hugh White, the verdict was read aloud. Not guilty. A wave of shock and disbelief rippled through the spectators. The men who had fired their weapons were being set free. The Patriot narrative had been shattered. But it was not a complete victory for the defense. 2 soldiers were found guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter. Hugh Montgomery, the man who was knocked down and fired the first shot, was one. The other was Matthew Kilroy, as witnesses had proven his specific grudge against one of the victims. The jury had carefully distinguished between collective panic and individual malice. These 2 men had escaped the hangman's noose. Now, a bizarre legal escape hatch from another era opened for them. It was called the benefit of clergy, an ancient law allowing a first-time offender's death sentence to be reduced if they could prove they were literate. The test was simple. They had to read 1 verse from the Bible. In the middle of the courtroom, Montgomery and Kilroy were handed the holy book. They read. Their lives were spared, but they would not leave unmarked. An iron was heated until it glowed cherry red. One by one, the letter M for manslaughter was burned into the flesh of their thumbs. The hiss of the branding iron was the final painful sound of the Boston Massacre trials. John Adams later reflected on this period with immense pride. He called his defense of the soldiers one of the best pieces of service I ever rendered my country. It was a strange victory that cost him friends and business in the short term. But in the long run, it established the moral bedrock for the nation he would help create. The trials became a powerful, practical demonstration of American ideals in action, not just in theory. The trial was more than a verdict for 8 men. It was a declaration to the world, and especially London, that the colonists were not a lawless mob. They proved they could administer impartial justice, even to their hated occupiers. This commitment to fairness stood in stark contrast to the Crown's own policies. London would later insist on dragging colonists across the ocean for trial, far from a jury of their peers. The message from Boston was clear. We believe in the rule of law more than you do. The principles Adams fought for in that courtroom became the DNA of American justice. The idea that every single person, no matter how despised, has an absolute right to a lawyer. The principle that facts must triumph over popular passion. He also cemented the right to a jury of your peers, not a distant government, to decide your fate. These were not just clever legal arguments to win a case. They were a rehearsal for a new kind of nation. Years later, when the time came to write a constitution, These ideals were not abstract theories. They were battle-tested principles forged in the crucible of this very trial. They are written directly into the Bill of Rights. The Sixth Amendment, guaranteeing a fair trial and the right to counsel, is the ghost of those 8 soldiers. John Adams had lost the propaganda war in 1770, but his legal victory provided the blueprint for the just society the revolution was supposedly all about. The jury's verdict did not kill the story. It made it immortal. The truth, as revealed in the courtroom, was complicated and unsatisfying. It was a story of shared blame and tragic confusion. The myth, however, was perfect. It had clear heroes, absolute villains, and a simple, infuriating moral. And in the years that followed, the people of Boston chose the myth. They didn't just remember it, they weaponized it. The primary weapon was an annual ritual. Every March the 5th, the city would observe Massacre Day. Thousands would pack into the Old South Meeting House. They would listen, rapt, as a leading patriot delivered a fiery oration. These speeches were not historical lectures. They were performances of outrage, carefully crafted to keep the wound from healing. The speakers would recount the horrors of that bloody night, conveniently omitting any mention of mob violence or the acquittals. It was a yearly injection of rage. Paul Revere's engraving became the official logo for this grievance. It was reprinted in almanacs and on broadsides, a constant visual reminder of British cruelty. The image was no longer just propaganda. It had become a sacred icon, a symbol of American innocence slaughtered by a foreign tyrant. Displaying it was an act of political defiance. This carefully maintained memory was not just for local consumption. It became the most potent piece of content for the committees of correspondence. Letters sent to Virginia or South Carolina didn't just speak of abstract legal rights. They spoke of the blood of martyrs on King Street. The massacre gave the Patriot Network a human story, a visceral argument that was far more persuasive than any debate over taxes. The trials had settled the legal fact, but the colonists had learned a more powerful lesson. A nation isn't founded on facts alone. It is founded on a story. The messy truth of what happened on King Street was quickly buried. The simple, powerful myth of the Boston Massacre became a cornerstone of the revolution, proving that the story you choose to believe can be the most stubborn thing of all. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Boston Massacre. We hope you enjoyed this journey through the messy truth of a street brawl, the calculated power of propaganda, and the landmark trial that helped define American justice. This story proves that how we remember an event is often more powerful than what actually happened. If you found this video informative, please consider liking and sharing it. Subscribing to the channel ensures you won't miss our next story from the pages of history. Thank you for watching.